My name is Blade, and this is my review of Final Destination Bloodlines. So, the long awaited, long anticipated next installment of the Final Destination series has made it to our screens, and I definitely have thoughts, comments, and opinions, so let's get into them. Of course, starting off with spoiler free. So, with this new Final Destination, there is a little bit of a change up in the typical format. So, allow me to tell you the premise, which is plagued by a violent and reoccurring nightmare, a college student heads home to track down the one person who might be able to break the cycle of death and save her family from the grisly demise that inevitably awaits them all. So, what's different here is, normally in the Final Destination franchise, it's like a group of friends or, just a group of people who are all supposed to go through this crazy catastrophe. But in this movie, it is a family who is being kind of like slowly hunted down by death. And the reason for that is, and I can say this without it being a spoiler, it's in the trailer, the matriarch, the grandmother of this family, once upon a time, went through the traditional like Final Destination situation that we get, where she gets a premonition of this like crazy disaster, and then it ends up happening, and everybody slowly dies one by one. But in this situation, she like saves everybody, and then years later, here it's coming back to get them. So this is very different. Normally it's the disaster is supposed to happen, and these like few survivors who made it out start getting picked off one by one over the course of like the next few days. Whereas this one is not only a family, but this is like several decades later. So, as far as that format change goes, I have to say that I really enjoyed it. I thought it gave something fresh, even though I think we'd all be okay with just like another Final Destination movie, because you can just take that format and lock it into a new situation. That's how all the other movies operate. But I think it being so long and it being like the sixth installment, I think it was a smart idea to like bring in something new, because it did feel extremely new. And I think the family aspect added a lot of emotion to it that's not normally in a Final Destination movie. And I also like that, since the grandmother was the person who like started this whole thing, in a way we got to see a disaster and Final Destination in a completely different setting. Like it was back in the, I don't know, I don't exactly remember what decade, but it was like back in like the 50s or the 60s, I think. Maybe the 70s, probably not though. I'm not quite sure. But because all the Final Destination franchise started in like 1999, 2000. So it was interesting to see it take place in a different time. Now, of course, the rest of the movie is, when we're not looking at that, is in the present. But I still thought that was really interesting and something fresh. And I also think that they were very smart in knowing that we'd be anticipating a lot of certain things. So this format change allowed it to be a new experience, even for someone like me who like grew up with the franchise. I've seen all five movies, I own them all on DVD. It really made it a fresh experience. I of course always like to touch upon the acting, and I would have to say overall it was well acted. This isn't like a Oscar nominated level of like performance, but it's a Final Destination movie. That's not what we're here for. I think everybody in this film did a great job. They did what they needed to do. I think the two more main characters, being Stephanie and Charlie, who are siblings. Stephanie being the main character who like gets like the nightmare. I think they did great jobs. It's Kaitlyn Sant Kaitlyn Santa Juana and Tio Briones. I think they did really great. I think they had great like sibling chemistry that I believed, and there was that emotional aspect to their characters. I also think Owen Joyner, who played a cousin in the family, was a really good character. I thought that actor he was really funny, and at first he kind of seemed like he was going to be like a himbo type character, but then he ended up being kind of a little bit more sweet and like well rounded out, and like he wasn't dumb. He was just really emotional, I guess. And I really enjoyed his character. I thought he played his part really well. He was really funny and endearing to watch. But, but, let's talk about the character slash actor who, everybody's been talking about. It's on everybody's minds, which is the character Eric, played by Richard Harmon. Eric is, for anyone who saw the teaser that came out a couple months ago before the film trailer, he was the character they teased in the death sequence with the tattoo parlor and the piercings, and he gets like lifted up by his nose piercing and all that. I would have to say he is probably the character that's going to come out of this movie being the most memorable. Like, people really fell in love with him. I see why. He's really funny, and there's a little bit of a something that goes on with his character that I'll talk about more in spoilers, but he is definitely like I guess probably like the fan favorite of the movie, and I see why. He was really, I thought he was well acted, and he was very funny, and also not to mention, he's a little alt guy of your dreams type of vibe. I'll be, when this movie gets released on streaming and or DVD, I will be waiting for the edits. Oh wait, but I know how to edit. Anyways, really enjoyed his performance, and I hope to see him in other projects. On the acting note, I also think I have to obligatorily, if that's a word, mention Tony Todd. He is a franchise staple, and this is also his last project that we are getting since him having passed away. And, of course, he did not disappoint. I was very happy when I got to see him on screen. He did a great job as always, but I think I have to save most of what I have to say about Tony Todd in this film until the spoilers, but rest assured, he was there and it was great. This is something I don't usually talk about in my reviews, but I think in some movies it's hard to not talk about it, and I think in this film I definitely need to mention the casting. I thought this movie had great casting, of course all the people that I already mentioned, but I thought everybody seemed like a family, both in the way that they looked and also just like the chemistry they had together. But what I really want to talk about with the casting is we do get to see the grandmother character in the past and in the present, so a young actress and an older actress, and the casting department ate down. Not only did I think that it was believable in like mannerisms and stuff that it was the same person, but the older actress and the younger actress look like they could be the older and younger versions of one another, so I thought the casting department ate that up. So something I really enjoyed about the writing in this Final Destination film is there was a lot of great setups, and they really understood the expectations going into this movie. And what I mean the expectations, I don't mean the of how this film, like how good or how bad this film will be. What I mean is they understand that we all, for the most part, like grew up with the format and we know what we're getting into, and they really did a good job of understanding that. And I can't say like too much without like spoiling, but it was not very predictable. Like, sure, like some of the deaths you can kind of like suss out where they were gonna go, but as far as like the actual like narrative, like layout of the story, I was a little surprised at how it went, and not in a bad way at all. Like, I just did not expect the story to move in the way that it did, and I felt like it's because they understood what our expectations were, and they knew how to both equally subvert them, but also like give you what you want. Like, I thought it was very, very clever. The Final Destination team definitely knew what they were doing with this film. So, before I get into spoilers, allow me to touch upon, what you're probably waiting for me to touch upon if it's a Final Destination review, which is the kills. And obviously, I'm not going to spoil any of them, but what I will say about them overall is I think some people find them a little bit disappointing, and I can understand why some of like a lot of them aren't like super like grand and like hugely like orchestrated kills, but I feel like I'm not mad at them. Like I had a good time with it, and I think a lot of them had really great setups. Like the way they ended up happening, except for maybe like one, wasn't necessarily what I thought was gonna happen, even though I saw the setup for it as it was happening. I still wasn't like super clocked into like how it was gonna unfold. So overall, I think they were pretty fun. They're definitely not the bloodiest of the franchise, but I think they work in this context. And I'm more referring to like the actual kills throughout the film, not like the disaster per se, but the disaster, we'll get into that in spoilers now. That, if you want to talk about kills, okay? So overall, before I get into spoilers for anybody who wants to, watch it for yourself, I think this is a fun Final Destination movie, and I was very happy with it. I'm gonna be honest, when I sat in the movie theater until the movie was actually starting, I didn't really even like process like, oh, this is like a brand new Final Destination movie. Like I don't know what's gonna happen. Like all these kills are gonna be brand new to me. All these like setups and everything is gonna be something new to me. So it's a really fun time. I'm glad they made it. Lately these days I'm very critical of reboots and sequels because I just want more original ideas. But with something like this and the way they did it, I don't mind because you can tell there was purpose and reason in reopening the franchise, and it was also like new and updated. So as far as like remakes, sequels, reboots go, this is a very welcomed one and one that I liked, one that was fun, and I think if you like the franchise, even if it's not your favorite film in the franchise, you will have a good time. So, with all of that out of the way, if you do not wish to be spoiled, you should take a little step back now, because I will be getting into spoiler territory, but you can always take a little jump on over in the timestamps to my final spoiler free thoughts. Alright, hello. Welcome to the spoilers section. First thing I want to touch upon is kind of like the overall setup because it is not what I thought. I don't know why, but for some reason when I went into the movie, I thought we were going to get like two disaster sequences. For some reason, my interpretation of this idea was it was going to be something happens, like a disaster situation happens with this family that starts to trigger the death thing, but they kind of discover that this is always coming from them, and then we get a flashback to the original disaster. But no, the movie opens up with the disaster that happens to the grandma character, and we see how she saves everybody, and then years later, death starts to do its thing, and I really like that. I don't know why I thought it was going to be the other way around. I guess for some reason that's just like what I imagined, but I really liked that way of doing it because it left an air. It did leave a little air of mystery of like, where does it go from here? Especially because in the trailer, I realized really quickly at a certain part of the movie, I was like, oh wow, the trailer is using footage from like maybe the first 20-30 minutes of this movie, and then everything else after that is just like you don't know what's happening in this movie. So I don't know why I thought it was going to go the other way, like, but why that I thought that was going to be the layout of the movie, but I did not mind the way they did it at all. I thought it was really interesting. Also, I could be wrong, but I want to say the disaster sequence, like the opening disaster sequence, which is basically this restaurant that's like at the top of this really high tower, collapse. Well, it doesn't collapse at first. At first, like the glass floor breaks, and then that eventually chaos ensues. And I want to say this might be the longest disaster sequence and also the most chaotic. Because don't get me wrong, I mean we've had the roller coaster, we've had the highway. But something about this one was just so like relentless. I was like, oh my god, like everything that you could possibly think of that could go wrong, like went wrong. Like the floor break, a fire broke out, the piano falls. Like it was just like no, but like anything and everything that could hypothetically happen and go wrong, in fact, did. Which, speaking of that, with everything going wrong, I really appreciate how many, like, callbacks there was in this movie. Like, Death was really being a cheeky little son of a bitch in this movie because, so, two main things to take away from the OG disaster that happens with the grandma and her premonition is one, the glass falling, out of the floor of the building, and also this little boy is throwing pennies off the roof, and this guy's like, "Don't do that, you're gonna kill somebody," but he still does it. But this penny goes into like a vent, and that contributes to the disaster. And both of those things return later in the movie. There's a couple things that happen with the family as they're being like hunted down by death that involve like a glass shard and glass, and then also it ultimately leads to the demise of the last two remaining members of the family is a penny. So I thought that was so cool that they did that they were like, Death said, I'm all the way from way back then, you bitches weren't even there, but it's coming back to get you now. And that was another thing they did too, is the opening shot is of like a railroad track, and what ends up getting the gals in the end is a derailed train. So I was like, y'all, I was really into that. I really appreciated that, that attention to detail, and like how they really were like, Death will not only come back to get you, but he doesn't forget his means of doing so. So as I mentioned in the spoiler section, I think they did a really good job of understanding the expectations, and that this was like a sequel and a long-awaited sequel, and that we'd be going in with like certain ideas and certain expectations, and they played to that very well, because honestly it takes quite some time for the deaths in the family to actually get going, and then once they do, it's not like super, like, it's not like the other movies where it's like hit after hit after hit after hit. Like, it's a little bit spread farther apart, at least it felt like so to me, and I actually really enjoyed that because it's a Final Destination movie. Like, you go in knowing that those things are coming, so they're not, I like that they weren't necessarily in a rush to give it to you, especially because the opening disaster scene is so like fucking crazy, and like you get a lot in that you on by the time that it takes for the family to start dying, you're not sitting here like, like, where's the death, because that opening scene was like, holy fucking shit. So I thought they just played to that really well, and they also knew like what we'd be looking at, like, oh god, is this gonna break or whatever. So a lot of the death sequences also don't happen in the way you expect them to, and I think they also have a lot of really great setups, because something will happen, something really tiny happens, but all this stuff happens in between, that what ends up finally killing them is actually that little tiny thing that happened in the beginning. But they were really playing with the way that we've become used to Final Destination deaths happening, that they kind of totally subverted the way that they even go down, and I thought that was really cool. So the kills, disappointing or not? Well, as I mentioned earlier, I wasn't necessarily disappointed by them, but I can understand why they'd be lackluster to some people, because the disaster, that's in that high up restaurant was really intense, and then also when the first member of the family dies, the brother or the dad, those are both like really like grisly, like kind of like deaths, like really intense, and they're kind of like, holy shit, like fuck yeah kind of deaths. Whereas the other ones, I guess I could see how people would be a little bit disappointed, because okay, so the sister in the Cousins, Julia, she ends up getting taken out by a garbage truck, which is fun. I think that's fun. But what I will say, that is the only one for me that I was a little bit like, oh, like not disappointed by, but just surprised that it was that simple. Like, I was expecting, like, more things to happen, because they're trying to save her from getting crushed in the garbage truck. So I was really surprised that that's all that like happened, because normally in Final Destination movies, when they're trying to save somebody from something, they do kind of, and then it ends up not working out. Like something else gets them, or like it's like JK, like it's still the machine or whatever's still on. Whereas this one, they literally just don't save her in time. But I'm not like mad at that. That is the one I will say where I was a little bit like, oh, Okay. So, with the other deaths, I think the brother and sister at the end, when they get taken out by the logs on the train, I was fine with that because that is normally how these movies end. You know, something takes them out kind of like really quick at the end to be like, you know, you can't escape death. And I also like the log thing because that's a callback to Final Destination 2 and like the iconic log truck that traumatized us all. But with the other two characters, the brothers on the cousins side, I guess the one cousin dying from the spring, there's a vending machine spring that kills him. I guess I could see as a little bit disappointing, but I was kind of into it because they set that up like fucking 10 to 5 minutes before it even happens, and you're kind of like wondering where that's gonna go, but then Eric dies in this like crazy way, which we also discover early on he's not even part of the lineage. So you're like surprised that he's even dying because it didn't seem like, you know, it just seemed like he was going to be safe, but he was fucking with Death's plan, so Death took him out. So that spring ends up coming back around. I guess I could see how it's disappointing that's just a spring to the head, but also I kind of liked it in the sense that they set that up so long ago, and then it finally comes back, and it's like I like the follow through. So I mean, if you're wanting more like grisly stuff, I can see the disappointment, but I don't find that this movie is lacking in the like crazy intense deaths because sure it's not the individual deaths all the time, but it's the there is a healthy amount of it. But that's just my opinion. Lastly, I want to talk about Tony Todd and how, first of all, great to see him. Did a great job, of course, but what I was not expecting was them to add some lore to his character, and it's honestly some lore that makes a lot of sense, which is death has been coming to him throughout this whole series as well, and he's actually tied into this little family because their grandma ended up saving him in that original disaster, and not only that, he would have died after her in the premonition. So once the whole family is taken out, it's his turn, and that is a little bit sad that this beloved character, you know, is gonna like, you know, in the universe. I guess we know now that after the events of this movie, he also gets taken out. But I really like that because I did not see it coming. I probably should have, but I literally like went in the movie theater once I like realized what was going on and they were like narrating that. But we love Tony Todd. Rest in peace, Tony Todd. And I really loved that. And moreover, I love that at the end of the movie it said in memory of Tony Todd. I thought that was very touching. Alright, so if you sat through all of that, thank you so much. You know, I try not to make my reviews too long, especially after my last one on Clown in a Cornfield was really long, but this has been a long awaited movie, and it's a franchise that I really like, so of course I think anybody who's reviewing it or talking about it has a lot to say on it. But those are my thoughts, comments, and opinions on Final Destination Bloodlines. I think it's a great addition to the franchise. It's one of the few reboots or long, you know, like sequels coming out way several years later that I'm honestly really okay with. Dare I say it's the first sequel of the year that has been, I don't want to say good, but like I'm glad they made the sequel. It's not very fan service. Like I definitely think fans will like it, but they didn't just like play to fans. I think they did something really new, really refreshing, and dare I say I wouldn't be mad if they announced that a Final Destination 7 will be happening. So those are my thoughts, comments, and opinions on Final Destination Bloodlines. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one. Okay, I can get this edited, have it up for tomorrow. That's weird. My fan turned on its own, but that's okay. I'm just a little on edge because I just watched Final Destination. Nothing to worry about. Wait, no.
A few moments later.